kind introduction and also the invitation to be your speaker tonight, and the kind hospitality that I've experienced so far. And I'd like to say, before I start anything, that the title, The Complex and Sophisticated Nature of Religion and Popular Culture Scholarship, sounds very daunting. It was actually assigned to me. So I don't know how complex or sophisticated this is going to be, but it is based on sort of years of experience and sort of reflection, particularly on my work on the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture, but on other involvements as well. And to begin with, the graphic for this presentation, the caricature that you saw on the advertising, on the posters, is based obviously on this photograph, which I think is a little bit more flattering to me perhaps than the poster, but you be the judge. And it requires a little bit of explanation. And when I sent it, I just wanted to send a photograph of me that was kind of fun, and wasn't necessarily connecting it to religion and popular culture, but it requires a little bit of explanation, as I said. And it was taken in Turkey, actually, a couple of years ago, outside a very posh and a very pricey pottery workshop that caters to tourists, okay? The sculpture is immediately recognizable to religious studies types, and really more broadly in popular culture, as the prehistoric great goddess, so-called, as constructed by contemporary goddess spirituality. Okay. So really, she's prehistoric, and yet she belongs to a very new religious tradition. And this statuette here, or her original, may in fact be a precursor to the great mother goddess Sibylla of ancient Anatolia. But since she's prehistoric, and other figurines like this are prehistoric, nobody really knows whether she represents a deity at all. She may simply be a decoration, a portrait, a magical object, or all of the above, sort of take your pick. But part of the reason why we, at least in the religious studies field, but outside of academia as well, see her as a goddess is that archaeologists who uncovered similar woman-shaped figurines in the 19th and early 20th centuries sort of casually and kind of dismissively dubbed them Venuses or fertility goddesses. Probably without much actual reflection on whether or not these really were religious objects, or whether they represented deities at all. Yeah. And just how far this notion of sort of the Venus figurine has penetrated into popular culture is sort of illustrated by this little bizarro cartoon, where the caveman is holding his little figurine of the Venus, and he's comparing her to this sexy babe cave woman figure, and preferring the Venus of Willendorf, which is a very famous iteration of this ancient great goddess, preferring the Venus of Willendorf to this sort of human Venus. Now back to my little picture. Now, as I said, this equivalency was made for a long time by archaeologists very casually between these figurines and deities. But when contemporary goddess spirituality emerged in the latter decades of the 20th century, really since the 1970s, inspired by the work of an archaeologist, the Lithuanian archaeologist Marija Gimbutas, many of her archaeological colleagues furiously backpedaled away from the identification of these artifacts as goddesses, insisting that due to their prehistoric origins, they're really unidentifiable. So they're not really goddesses. We've just been calling them goddesses for decades. And they're probably not gods at all, much less anything that anybody would want to worship. However, the deed was done, and sort of thanks thanks to this sort of convergence of archaeological sauciness and kind of sloppiness, and the emergence of a new women's religion, which the archaeologists didn't know what to do with, sculptures of this kind became widely recognizable as goddesses, to the point that a giant figurine outside a pottery factory in Cappadocia, of all places in the world, could be featured to appeal to the hordes of tourists, including sort of spiritual tourists on goddess pilgrimage, as to a putative hotbed of prehistoric goddess worship. Could be regarded as instantly recognizable. And this in a country where the vast majority of the population is made up of resolutely monotheistic Muslims, who nonetheless are quite proud of their heritage of ancient goddesses, at least those in the tourism industry, who actually end up making quite a lot of money out of this lady and other representations like her, whether she's really a goddess or not. Now, this brief example, which seems a little bit out there in terms of popular culture as we know it, briefly sort of illustrates the ubiquity, it's everywhere, and complexity of the realm of religion and popular culture, where the ancient and the contemporary, this ancient goddess or whatever she was, and contemporary spiritual tourists, goddess feminists, the spiritual and the commercial, historical acumen and spiritual yearning come together in this sort of infinite array of configurations of religion on the one hand, popular culture, as well as popular spirituality, which in and of itself is a subset of popular culture. So popular spirituality, a sort of a part of that broader range of popular culture. Now, my claim to fame in this area of study, as Bill mentioned, is that I'm the founding editor of the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture, which actually had very modest beginnings not that long ago in the great scheme of things, although to students it may seem like a long time ago. Had modest beginnings on the website of the Department of Religious Studies, as it was then called. It's gone through many name changes over the years, at the University of Saskatchewan way back in 2001. Okay. And like many entrants into the field, and the field of this academic study of religion and popular culture was very novel at that time. But my interest, as I was telling Bill and others at dinner time today, was sparked by my own fandom, and that's how it often starts. It starts with an enthusiastic student or academic who becomes a fan of something or other, and they want to sort of express that and analyze that academically. At least that's how it happened for me. And in this case, my fandom was completely unprecedented in my life up to that point, and really since. But my own fandom in this case was of an obscure science fiction series called Prey that came out in 1998, and all of the episodes were shown eventually in 1998. And here's one of the many graphics associated with that wonderful series. And Prey, again, obscure little sci-fi show on ABC TV at that time. But what happened was it attracted this pretty small but very intense, extremely enthusiastic, and mostly female, there were a few men involved, but mostly female audience that was appalled by the cancellation of this wonderful, brilliant, fascinating show after 8 episodes. We were devastated. My life revolved around that show, as I was telling Bill and some others at dinner. It was really weird. It was something I'd never experienced before. This was at a time when the internet was starting to be kind of usable, and one of the Pray-mates, as we called ourselves, posted a message board so that we could communicate with one another. And we sort of formulated a campaign to keep Pray on the air because, as I've said, it was basically not so much canceled, but placed on a hiatus, which is the next best thing after 8 episodes. So we were just sort of left hanging there. And what happened was that we, Pray fans, managed to get 5 unaired episodes broadcast on ABC, which is a pretty Herculean task when you're dealing with a large American network, although unfortunately it was never renewed. And we did this through a concerted campaign of email and telephone and letter writing to these really bewildered network executives. They just didn't know what hit them. Producers, we got in touch with the producer of Pray, who was a very nice guy, and even cast members. So Pray fans were actually on the blower, especially those who lived in the LA area, to some of the actors in the show. So we were energized and empowered to pursue our passion for Pray for whatever reason at the time. Now, from my perspective as a fan, and I was as rabid as any of them, like I said, I've never really experienced anything quite like it before or since. So as a fan who was as devoted to the show as my sister Praymates, and a few brother Praymates, I guess, and who was also a scholar of religion, so I was unique in that aspect. I was fascinated by the cult-like following that it had attracted. Okay? So we hear about sort of cult movies and cult TV series and cult this and that, but this really did have a cult-like quality to it. In a positive way, not a negative way, because there was sort of a spiritual resonance to the show that appealed to me anyway. And what I wanted to do was sort of analyze it and publish an article, just sort of examining the reasons for its appeal, which were kind of mysterious to me. So why did it appeal so strongly to me, as well as to others, to the point that we were willing to engage in all of these kind of very unprecedented kinds of activities? And with a little bit of research into the material that was available at that time, I learned that Pray was exactly the kind of TV show that female viewers flocked to. That is, it sort of has this basic storyline of an aloof but fascinating male meets an independent, passionate female kind of thing. So women just love this storyline, although I'm not usually attracted to that kind of a storyline. It hooked me with Pray. And women love these kinds of TV shows, and if you're wondering what men prefer, it's comic books, actually, as my friend Mark over here will attest to. I also discovered, as I was sort of mulling over sort of the characters and the storylines, I also discovered that it also conformed to the sort of Christ figure archetype, with the hero sort of being a Christ figure, an intermediary between two species, with a strong dose of Mary Magdalene thrown in. And the Mary Magdalene figure was the main female lead of the show, who was a scientist. I think a less successful, but more original and less annoying version of Twilight. Okay? So that was basically what was going on with Pray at the time. A lot more original and utterly fascinating, unlike that. Well, I'm sorry for I apologize to Twilight fans, but it was way better. And it also had a very nasty Antichrist kind of figure thrown in. And the sort of archetypes that were sort of embedded in the script, consciously or unconsciously, and just the way that Pray was presented, were pretty clear to me, I guess, on analysis. And my little article on Pray became the first article to be published in the journal. Eventually, but at that time, as I was in the throes of my Pray fandom, unfortunately, there weren't any peer-reviewed academic journals that published this kind of work. There was just nothing. apart from a few anthologies here and there. The Journal of Religion and Film, some of you may know that journal, had been around for a few years but was strictly interested in cinema, and they're still only interested in cinema. So way back when I was in urban studies, I had founded a print journal, the Canadian Journal of Urban Research, back in the early 90s. So what I did, now that I was living in Saskatchewan and working on the U of S campus, is that I applied for a publication grant from the University of Saskatchewan, and several months later, I was successful in my grant application. It didn't take a lot of money. I published the first issue almost single-handedly. I did have a webmaster. But really on a shoestring, the first issue of a new online-only sort of peer-reviewed academic journal, which was quite an innovative venture at the turn of the millennium, although it seems like only yesterday to me, just in terms of the development of academic publishing. It's quite a long time ago. Because this was a time when online journals were a novelty. They were kind of looked at askance by academic leaders. Not to mention another innovation, and that is the field of religion and popular culture. Now, the need for this kind of publishing outlet and the growth of this wide-ranging and interdisciplinary field of study is attested to by the fact that 3 issues of the journal have been published annually since fall 2002, and that it was adopted, actually, when I was ready to sort of hand it over to the professionals. It was adopted by the University of Toronto Press in January 2012, and this is the U of T Press format that you see up on the screen. At the U of T Press, it remains an online-only journal, so it sort of kept that identity. It's accessible if you want to access it. If you're not familiar with it, it's accessible both through the University of Toronto Press and Project Muse. And in 2013, it was actually profiled by the very prestigious Routledge journal, Religion. And so it sort of stood the test of time, and it's gained a fair amount of academic prestige since its very humble and modest beginnings back in 2001. Now, the success and appeal of this journal and this area of study is illustrated by the astonishing fact, and I just noticed this a couple of weeks ago myself, that my personal homepage on Academia EDU, which is what this is a screen capture of, and it has like 16 million registered users, but my personal homepage is in the top 3% of views on Academia EDU. Like I said, that amounts to 3% of 16 million is, I looked it up yesterday actually, 480,000. But it really is very striking that little old me sitting in Saskatoon would attract so much interest. And of course, the reason my page gets so much traffic is not because, A, I'm so great and so famous, not because of my articles in traditional biblical and religious studies journals, and that's the majority of my publications. So it's not because of my work in feminist theology and avian metaphors, or Christian origins and egalitarianism and utopia, which are, these sort of mainstream biblical studies, religious studies, theology kind of pursuits, but because of the religion article about the JRPC, as well as because of my relatively few articles in the pop culture realm. So if you can see the listing up on the screen, you'll notice that by fairly recent searches for material associated with me relates to the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture, an article that I wrote years ago that was actually published in the Journal of Religion and Film on the use of biblical motifs in horror movies, so religion and popular culture. I get a huge number of hits on a piece that I actually published in the past couple of years on the Cathar beliefs on about the marriage of Mary Magdalene and Jesus as sort of represented in popular culture and popular spirituality. And another related article in the journal Feminist Theology, actually, that relates to contemporary sort of goddess spirituality, but that also brings in the Mary Magdalene figure, about the tendency of goddess feminists to see Mary Magdalene as a kind of goddess figure. That is the deification of Mary Magdalene. And other than these articles, I really haven't written that much in the religion and pop culture field, but you can see that people are interested in and really hungry for this kind of content, which puts me in the top 3%. Again, amazingly enough, not because of me, but just because of it's not because of my identity, but it's because of the message that I'm sort of associated with. Now, since 2001, the phenomenon of online journals has been well accepted to the point of necessity in academia. So pretty much every academic journal worth its salt now has some kind of an online presence. And as the burgeoning of publications in the area of religion and popular culture illustrates, this area of study has also become much more prominent in the past 15 years. But unlike web-based publishing, it continues to suffer from its relative novelty because academia is very slow to adapt to new currents in the broader culture. So it continues to suffer from its relative novelty as an area of academic inquiry. And from the notion that popular culture, as opposed to religion, is trivial and ephemeral and not as worthy of the attention of serious scholars as high culture and the study of the great traditions. And high culture and the study of the great traditions are just great. But this raises the question from the standpoint of a definition of religion, and there are many definitions of religion, but from the standpoint of a definition of religion as a process of meaning-making and values conceived as sacred by any given culture or individual, why the experience and artifacts of a pop culture phenomenon like Prey or Twilight or South Park is less important than, for example, and here's my example, a shred of ancient papyrus that might or might not refer to Jesus' wife. Okay, and everybody probably remembers the minor kerfuffle a couple of years ago over the discovery of this so-called Gospel of Jesus wife. And it's actually a very tiny fragment of papyrus that, again, may or may not refer to some such person. Now, assuming that the text is in fact ancient and that it does in fact assume that Jesus was married, it's impossible to know who wrote it, for what reason, serious doctrine, historical reminiscence, scurrilous slur, mischievous forgery, misinformation. And it's also impossible to know how many early Christians were actually influenced by it or whose beliefs it reflects, if any. It may have been a sort of one-off production by an eccentric author. We just don't know. Certainly, far fewer people were influenced by this little old so-called Gospel of Jesus wife than fans of the Hunger Games, who number in the millions. Now, the minor media frenzy sparked by the announcement of this so-called gospel in 2012, when you think about it, actually had a lot more to do with the popularity of the Da Vinci Code. So it feeds into that sort of Da Vinci Code, Jesus was married sort of speculation. And it's sort of sensational ideas about the romance between Jesus and Mary Magdalene and their possible offspring. So the excitement over this gospel fragment probably had a lot more to do with pop culture, Da Vinci Code, and its sort of spin-offs and its precursors than with the actual historical significance of the ancient manuscript fragment. So as an ancient manuscript fragment, it's kind of interesting for sort of antiquarian reasons, but the reason why it gains so much interest from the media and on Facebook and everywhere else was that it related to this pop culture sort of emergent tradition about Jesus and Mary. In itself an illustration of the power and scope and the complexity of the relationship between scholarship and religion and popular culture. So the scholarship feeds into this pop culture religious kind of narrative that was wildly popular sort of in the first decade of the 21st century. Now, the most recent offering in this sort of pop cultural Mary Magdalene romance that in a way goes back to the Middle Ages but has much more recent iterations that are quite distinct, is Jacobovich and Wilson's The Lost Gospel, which I've got illustrated up here as well. Some of you may have heard of it or read it, I don't know, but it claims the discovery of a document that actually, if you read the book, is neither lost, it's been around for quite a long time, nor a gospel. It's actually a well-known Syriac translation of the early Jewish, or maybe early Christian, sort of Asenath romance, the story of Joseph and Asenath. The translation that they're so excited about in this book actually dates to the 6th century. And what Joseph and Asenath is, if you're not familiar with that ancient text, is a mystical retelling of the story of the marriage of the patriarch Joseph and his Egyptian bride that's taken by the authors to be a sort of allegorical, cryptic representation of the marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Well, historically speaking, probably not. So, not lost, not a gospel, probably not about Jesus and Mary Magdalene at all. Now, a further sort of example of the complexity of this area of study that relates to this whole Mary Magdalene, Jesus romance, Da Vinci Code, Lost Gospel kind of scenario is that recently a junior colleague of mine at the college mentioned to me that some of her students had been offended when she told them that people in southern France believed that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were married. And she had discussed this in class sort of as a piece of factual information that people in the south of France just have this long-standing belief in the marriage between Jesus and Mary. And I, because this is something I've actually studied to some extent, I hopefully tactfully told her that this is not a traditional belief of the Catholics of Provence. The medieval Cathars do seem to have held some such belief, but they were sort of stamped out by the 13th century. It's not a belief system that was widely subscribed to in the Middle Ages, or even less so in modern day France. So the Cathars do seem to have had some such idea, but it was a far cry from the romantic speculations of popular writers like Margaret Starbird, who's one of the sources for the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown, and most recently Jacobovich and Wilson. Okay. So somehow this sort of speculation about romantic, fictional speculation about Jesus and Mary Magdalene had made its way into a university classroom, and here it was being presented as factual in some way. Now, to be fair, my colleague had gotten this information from another scholar, and she was kind of skeptical about his sources, but she mentioned it in class anyway, just to stir things up, which it did, obviously. But this is really a great example of how material represented as historical in pop culture, which it is in the Da Vinci Code, and it is in the writings of Margaret Starbird, who kind of originated this Mary Magdalene romance, as I call it. How material represented as historical in pop culture can seep into sort of mainstream academic discourse and thence into the classroom. So in a way, it's an example of maybe what not to do when you're presenting these kinds of kind of out there ideas to students as historical facts. So do a little bit of digging before you do that. Now, the difficulty of the study of religion and popular culture is inherent not only in its relative newness and its supposed lack of seriousness and gravitas, but in its inherent interdisciplinarity. Okay? Not only should it require familiarity with the field of religious studies, which is very large in and of itself, but it also necessarily ventures into the also relatively new enterprise of pop culture studies. And with popular culture here referring to the products of contemporary mass culture, and including, but not confined to, film, TV, the internet, video games, sports, social media, spiritual tourism, science fiction and fantasy, romance fiction, comic books, anime, etc., etc., etc. So pop culture is this huge, sort of amorphous kind of body of material. And obviously, nobody can be an expert in any but a few of these areas, and I certainly don't claim to be, and there are others with much more expertise than I have. Now, it's also an area of inquiry that is interdisciplinary in the sense that it's often undertaken by non-religious studies specialists. Anthropologists, historians, sociologists, etc., etc. The list goes on. And from the beginning, the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture was conceived as interdisciplinary and open to scholars from a variety of cognate fields who have contributed many fine articles to the journal. So many fine articles by anthropologists and sociologists and historians and all kinds of other scholars as well. However, I have come to see that the perspective of scholars of religion particularly, who see religion as a phenomenon with an integrity in and of itself, as opposed to or as more than simply a side effect of something else, social processes or economics or ecology or psychology, pathology, whatever. So this religious studies perspective that places a value and sort of centers on religion is uniquely valuable, obviously, in the study of religion and popular culture, although the other disciplines bring interesting dimensions as well. For example, and this is a very sort of commonplace example that you see all over the place, and it's been around for a long time in sort of explaining what pop culture is all about. There is a tendency for scholars to explain popular culture expressions rather, I would say, facilely and superficially in terms of contemporary anxieties about this, that, and the other thing, race, gender, terrorism, climate change, what have you. And these factors may all be relevant to the analysis, but they sort of leave it at that and never get to the religious implications of these sort of pop culture artifacts. Recent example, just again illustrating how pervasive this strategy has become in the coverage of popular culture, including the journalistic coverage of popular culture, is an explanation of, next slide, the overwrought FX TV series, The Strain, which was out just last spring, about a fast-moving plague that transforms human beings into particularly unappealing vampire-like monsters, like this guy. And the explanation that I read in the local newspaper, that actually is not that far afield from a lot of academic explanations that you find of these kinds of shows, is this journalist explained the production of The Strain in terms of fears sparked by the Ebola epidemic that was kind of raging at about the same time as the show appeared on TV. Now, superficially, this is kind of a persuasive explanation. It sounds good, and Ebola was all over the media at the time, but unfortunately it doesn't work because, like I said, the show was aired in 2014 during the outbreak, but the show was obviously made well before the epidemic even started to make the news. Okay, it was there in Africa, but it wasn't making the news in North America, certainly not in time to affect the production of this show. And I would suggest that from a religious studies standpoint, it might be more interesting to consider this series in the context of other sort of popular works featuring the undead, of which there are many, many. Twilight, The Walking Dead, World War Z or World War Z, Z Nation or Z Nation, whichever you want, whichever pronunciation of Z you want to use. This great fascination with zombies, particularly recently. And what all these various shows, the zombies, the vampires, do is maybe implicitly express contemporary hopes, in the case of Twilight in a weird way, and fears, mostly fears or anxieties about death and the afterlife. And books and movies like Heaven is for Real and Proof of Heaven are the sort of flip side of this phenomenon. So you've got this sort of great cultural fascination with death and with life after death that these kinds of productions relate to one way or another. And it also, because in its own way it is a portrayal of an end of the world kind of event. Of course, that needs to be thwarted by the heroes of the show. But it also might be considered as one of the many expressions of sort of ambient apocalyptic anxiety that really pervades our culture in all kinds of ways. So this sort of fascination with death and fascination with the end of the world and how to deal with those realities or unrealities. Now, a more mainstream example, I guess, of the necessity for specifically religious studies analysis of popular culture comes from my recent experience of teaching a directed reading course on spiritual tourism. Okay. And this is just an illustration of one of the few academic books written by a religious studies scholar in the area of spiritual tourism. So if you want to get in on the ground floor of an area of scholarship in religion and popular culture, spiritual tourism would be a good entry point. And the study of spiritual tourism is sort of a developing subfield of tourism studies that engages with the contemporary tendency of especially Western tourists to seek personal growth and enlightenment through their travels, either organized travels or individual travels, as opposed to the traditional aims of pilgrimage. Okay, so it's sort of like pilgrimage, but it's something different. What are the traditional aims of pilgrimage? Well, fulfillment of a religious obligation or of a vow, remission of sins. It's been a biggie throughout the ages in Christianity. Physical healing would be another one of these traditional aims of pilgrimage. whereas spiritual tourism is more sort of individualized and more about the construction of personal spiritual meaning. Now, like many other areas of popular culture, spiritual tourism is deeply implicated in commercial activity with important economic benefits for tour companies, tourism-related businesses, and in some cases, entire regions or even countries are heavily development on tourism dollars and thus are amenable and open to spiritual tourism. The more the better. Thus, the vast majority of academic studies of spiritual tourism, or it's sometimes called religious tourism or sacred tourism, secular pilgrimage, but the vast majority of academic studies of this phenomenon are written by non-religious studies scholars. They're written by tourism managers and geographers and sociologists, community planners, anthropologists. The list goes on, with results of varying quality, so some are better than others. They're often kind of superficial from the standpoint of somebody in the religious studies field, and they're sometimes simply wrong in their coverage of religious aspects of the spiritual phenomenon that they purport to analyze. They simply don't have the information, and they don't bother to consult with people or with publications that could help them. And the students in my very, very small class and I came across a particularly egregious example of this inadequate coverage of religion in spiritual tourism studies in a book of essays, not this book, another book, published again by a very prestigious academic press, where the chapter on sacred places and tourism in the Roman Catholic tradition by actually an economist who I won't name here, for reasons that will become apparent. If you want to know the name of the book or of the writer, I'll tell you later. But this economist, and I realize there's at least one economist in the audience, and I don't want to take the name of all economists in vain here, but this guy made some very astonishing claims about the relationship of Catholicism to the tourism business, or the enterprise of tourism. First, that secular and religious leaders in the Catholic Church have been more active in explaining the relationship between tourism and religion than any other faith tradition. So apparently Catholic theologians and Catholics in general are more gung-ho on tourism than other Christians, which is not the case. Secondly, that the Catholic understanding of human life as a journey towards eternal life forms the basis of theologians' acceptance of the place of tourism in the life of contemporary Catholics. I have never seen that connection made before, okay? And nor I'm sure have any of the theologians in this audience. So tourism, theology, life as a faith journey, they don't necessarily fit together. Well, although I guess they could. That one of the tenets, not tenets, but tenets, or tenets of Catholic doctrine, I work at a Catholic college, so I know a little bit about Catholic doctrine, perhaps not as much as I should, but one of the core Catholic belief is that all of the places associated with the Blessed Virgin are worshipped by the faithful, and Catholics don't worship places. And this is in an editorially and peer-reviewed essay. Number 4, biblical scholars will be interested to know that the Genesis 1:28 mandate to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it constitutes a challenge to believers to travel the world to get to know it and thus perceive themselves as masters of the entire earth, which tourism gives them the opportunity to do. It's a very, very unique interpretation of that sort of Genesis mandate. And I'm a biblical scholar, basically. I can see the biblical scholars in the corner giggling away. Furthermore, according to this scholar, both the Bible and Catholic tradition advocate the practice of hospitality, which they do, which the author asserts theology today, in the 21st century, and here I'm quoting, So the traditional practice of hospitality takes as proof of the emergence and duration of tourism in the contemporary conditions of modern civilization and the life of man who is seen as a theologically integrated being. That's a quotation from the article. I don't know what it means. Moreover, the author claims, rather ethnocentrically, that people in countries that are less secularized and where education systems are less developed are more eloquent in expressing their religious feelings than those in more developed nations, and have more of a need to express their faith by singing and dancing, which presumably makes these simple souls more interesting to Catholic tourists than people in more sophisticated locales. Finally, the author asserts that although, after all that he said about Catholic approbation of tourism, that although the Catholic Church approves theologically of tourism per se, so Catholics are fine with tourism, this approval does not extend to specifically religious tourism, which is the whole subject matter of his article, because the sacred and the profane cannot be both the content of the same moment in time, because he says their motivation is completely different. And again, I don't know what this means, and if I understand him correctly, that the sacred and profane cannot be both the content of or cannot be the content of the same moment in time. You know, so much for the doctrine of incarnation, not to mention the whole history of pilgrimage. Now, this is obviously, and as I said, I'm keeping the name of this scholar anonymous because it's just such an appalling piece of work. This is obviously a list of assertions, and this is my point, that nobody involved in the study of religion, or actually any fairly well-informed Catholic, which was what my students in the class were, would ever make. So they were able to pull this chapter apart very easily. But what it does is indicate the poor quality of the coverage of the topic of Catholics and tourism in this volume. This is a particularly dire example, but it illustrates the presupposition of this and some other academic offerings in the field from non-religious studies disciplines, certainly not all of them, but some of them, that understanding religion is easy and simple, anything goes, anybody can do it, and in this case, it's okay to make it up as you go along with a minimum of research or recourse to actual religious studies or theological scholarship, which exist in great abundance, and that this author certainly could have resorted to. Now, in fact, of the 18 chapters in this sort of nameless book on spiritual tourism, only one was actually written by a scholar of religion, which is kind of appalling and astonishingly, although admittedly, most of the chapters were better researched and argued than the one that I've just summarized. However, it does offer some salutary examples of what not to do in the study of religion and popular culture. First, as I kind of indicated, the fields of religious studies and theology are highly developed. They've been around for a long time. And even in the case of a relatively new phenomenon, such as spiritual tourism, which is a very late 20th into the 21st century kind of phenomenon, previous studies in these fields have a great deal to offer the analysis, such as pilgrimage studies and theologies of pilgrimage, although to be fair, the theology of pilgrimage is surprisingly undeveloped. So if you're a theologian, a theology of pilgrimage is a good entry point. A lot to do there. Expertise in a discipline such as economics, in the case of the author of this Catholicism article, or geography or sociology, or membership in a specific religious community does not necessarily translate into the ability to comment on popular religiosity. Or any kind of religiosity with any kind of academic credibility. Doesn't mean that people in these fields can't do a good job, but that expertise in a cognate discipline doesn't necessarily confer that expertise. So expertise, knowledge of religious studies and theology is not the be-all and end-all, but it helps. It helps a lot. And this book by Alex Norman, who is actually a scholar of religion, he teaches in the Department of Studies in Religion at the University of Sydney, to give him his due, illustrated on the slide, like I said, isn't the book that I was referring to, with these horrible examples of poor methodology and bad argumentation, but this is actually one of the few single author studies on spiritual tourism actually written by a scholar of religion, and it ended up being a much more helpful resource for the course than this anthology that I just referred to. So, far from being sort of an easy entree into religious studies, the field of religion and popular culture is highly challenging for several reasons. First, popular culture is ephemeral, it's ever-changing, and it's overwhelmingly abundant. And purveyors of popular culture, whoever they may be, inject this sort of bewildering array of religious themes and references into their productions with more or less cogency or contemporary relevance. They do it, whether they understand the full implications of their sort of religious references and allusions is debatable. And it's all up for analysis. Whether the great works of art that will stand the test of time, like the Lord of the Rings trilogy or the Chronicles of Narnia, or products of a less enduring appeal, like Prey, the dear departed Prey, or The Strain, which I'm not sure if there'll be a second season. So the field really runs a gamut of all kinds of genres and all kinds of qualities of work. To be considered any kind of an expert in the area, a scholar needs to keep up not only with developments in the scholarship, but also what's new in at least a cross-section of popular culture. And this is a challenge that's not faced by and large by scholars in the more sort of classical, traditional religious studies disciplines, where genuinely new developments and discoveries are rare, progress is slow, and often of lasting significance, something like the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Which they were there for a long time, and they'll be with us for a very long time in scholarly discourse. For emerging scholars inspired by their own fandom, as I was back in 1998, there's a temptation that I saw over and over again as editor of the JRPC, simply to describe the religious aspects of their favorite movie or TV series or video game without recourse to much research or method or theory. And all of these, of course, need to be brought to bear on this area of study. Another pitfall in a field as complex and multifarious as religion and popular culture is to see religion where it actually isn't. Sort of the idea that to a hammer, kind of everything looks like a nail. For example, and these are explanations of so-called religious phenomena that I've actually come across. Elderly men meeting for coffee at Tim Hortons each week, maybe a ritual of sorts, but I'm not sure it's actually religious, as I heard a colleague, a very erudite colleague once suggests. Not all rituals are religious rituals. Does the fact that some people are fanatically devoted to certain sports and go to games on Sunday rather than going to church mean that football or hockey or basketball is a religion? Not so sure of that. The case needs to be made, and it has been made many times by sports fans who have this sort of religion-like devotion to whatever. Finally, there is the question of employability for young scholars embarking on their careers. Can a specialization in religion and popular culture translate into a tenure track position? That's a very good question. And it is actually a question that applies, as some of you may know, to any field in religious studies in these job-scarce times. So why would I sort of risk my academic future by focusing on this very sort of marginal area of specialization when I could focus on something more sort of more mainstream? And I was actually surprised a couple of months ago and encouraged to actually see this posting for a job in religion and media, which is a closely related field, at the rank of assistant professor, tenure track position, advertised at the University of Toronto just back in the fall of 2014. So these kinds of jobs are out there or starting to be out there. So if this is the area of study that you want to pursue, there's hope for that magical tenure track position. I don't know if it's been filled yet. Now, just to conclude, on an equally encouraging note, the upsides of engaging in this area of study are many. First of all, it's simply fun. Okay, it's just a lot of fun. And it allows students and faculty to pursue their current interests and enthusiasms in an academically informed and disciplined way. So it interfaces with both the students and faculty members, sort of current fandoms, whatever they may be. The integration of popular culture into any area of religious studies or theology can add a welcome dimension to teaching that engages with student interests. Also, as a secondary area of academic interest, it can actually boost employability, and it often does. I've been on many search committees over the years, and the ability to sort of integrate the classical disciplines with more modern material or more up-to-date pop cultural material is always welcome. Compared with the relatively narrow scope of a traditional area of specialization, popular culture offers an abundance and ever-growing body of new material. As Conrad Ostwald observes, traditional religious authorities are increasingly inclined to adapt secular practices and products for sacred purposes, and pop cultural forms, and here I'm quoting, are becoming increasingly more visible vehicles of religious images and symbols and categories, which is another way of saying that the quantity of material for study just keeps growing and diversifying. There are also plenty of gaps in the literature, which to date, and I know this from editing the journal, which to date, this academic literature has been very American-dominated. No offense, Americans in the audience, but it has been biased towards Western traditions and woefully lacking in Canadian content. And since at this point I've covered the spectrum from the prehistoric goddess to the religion of hockey, I think it's time for some questions and discussion. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Beavis, for a very informative lecture. And as a biblical scholar and on a personal and professional note, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your pioneering work, which is bringing credibility to a most serious interdisciplinary form of scholarship.
Are there any shows or anything you're hooked on right now that you could shed a little bit of light on for us?
Well, there are lots of them actually, because there's so much good sort of series TV on cable. So Vikings, The Americans, but the thing is, the problem with pop culture scholarship is sometimes entertainment just needs to be entertainment. So unless something really resonates with me, I tend not to follow it up. I tend not to try not to make it into either sort of yet another academic assignment, and just enjoy a movie or a TV series or what have you, just in and of itself, for its own qualities, although there does tend to be a lot of religion buried in those kinds of cultural productions. I don't know if anybody's been watching The Americans. They watch that wonderful show. It's so interesting. It's about these two American spies, husband and wife, during the Cold War in the 1980s, living in deep cover in Washington, D.C. So nobody knows who they are. They don't speak Russian. They have 2 kids. They're normally sort of normal suburban parents. But they have a daughter who, is a teenager, and her adolescent rebellion involves becoming a Christian and joining a church, which is complete anathema, of course, to her parents. So these religious issues and sort of conflicts do emerge in all kinds of different TV series. Anyway, same thing with Vikings, where anybody watch Vikings? Vikings. There's actually a lot of material about Norse mythology, as well as the encounter between Catholics, the sort of Celtic Catholics, and the Viking religion, or the Norse religion. And so, but yeah. But most of my pop culture scholarship recently has been focused on the figure of Mary Magdalene and this sort of emergent Mary Magdalene romance, which is all over the place, including in the movies, but hasn't quite made it to series TV yet.
So, question over here, Steps. So, what do you think? Is there much research or literature on Harry Potter and religion? Is there a lot in that area?
Yeah, there is a lot. There are several books. A couple of articles in the JRPC.
What's your opinion on it? Is it valid work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Harry is a Christ figure. He's a pretty conventional Christ figure. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I got another question for you. Is most of your scholarship around TV shows and films, or do you do any video game analysis or fantasy does?
No, video games sort of passed me by, as did the 80s and 90s. It was the year 2000 before I realized that those decades had passed. So, yeah, something my students are very interested in, though, and that they do bring video game discussions into my classes at times. And like I said, I've really been most interested, since Prey, in really very kind of mainstream biblical studies, religious studies kinds of projects, and not that much religion and pop culture at all, except for the journal and by Mary Magdalene work. And for some reason, I've become a recognized expert on the use of the Bible in horror movies. Yeah.
One more? Mark is a former student of Dr. Beavis.
This is a question on methodology.
Mm-hmm.
So biblical studies is mostly textual based, or is textual based.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that you need to explore sort of methods in film or methods in analyzing television and film, right?
Mm-hmm.
That aren't inside biblical studies, or does biblical studies translate or transfer right into what you do?
I'd say the biblical studies helps, and I think certainly when I got interested in Prey, I kind of approached it as a biblical scholar would approach any sort of text or artifact. And I did tend to interpret, again, to a hammer everything looks like a nail. I did tend to interpret Prey in sort of biblical studies terms, with the Christ figure and the Mary Magdalene figure and the crucifixion scenes and the Antichrist figure and all those kinds of things. Although another project that I've been involved in for the past several years, and that's hopefully will soon come to fruition in a book, has been a study of women, again related a little bit to the Mary Magdalene material, women who combine Christianity and goddess spirituality. And in that instance, I really had to learn some social scientific methodology because I conducted a whole bunch of 100 interviews and a focus group and participant observer research at a goddess Lutheran church in San Francisco. Yeah. But so that was a very different kind of a project where I sort of took off my biblical scholar hat and became more of a social scientist, I guess, qualitative social scientist.